Welcome to our first virtual book talk. We have authors Karen Stone, who wrote Shipwreck on the Potomac, and Sylvia Bruner, who wrote The Wyoming Bomber Crash. So, Karen Stone has been the museum division manager for St. Mary's County, Maryland since 2017. She did her undergraduate work at the Gettysburg College and obtained her master's degree from Penn State University. She's been working in the museum field ever since. She has been a Lincoln fan and a student of his assassination since childhood. She was fascinated when she first heard this story with its connection to Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth. She was surprised to find that it had been overlooked by history. In her spare time, Karen sings with the chamber choral of Fredericksburg and at as many Fredericksburg Nationals baseball games as she can. Sylvia Bruner has worked in the museum field since 2000. As the executive director of the Jim Gatchell Memorial Museum, she has guided the museum through reaccreditation by the American Alliance of Museums and was there when the museum received the Institute for Museum and Library Services National Medal. The museum is the repository of artifacts related to Bomber Mountain and has a permanent exhibit on the topic. For Bruner, the museum serves as a constant reminder to research and compile this story. So we're going to let Karen start.
My project and Sylvia's are similar in that they are both military mishaps, but I don't have a site. I don't have a vessel. I don't have a list of people. I don't have any of the stuff with which Sylvia started. Mine was much more from scratch, but we both have come a long way in getting these stories out that were lost for a time. It's always been said that not a single life was lost during the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, and that's said with pride. However, it's not true. In the 1860s, life on the Potomac River was quite different than it is today. It was the front line of battle, the main lifeline out of Washington, D.C., and for the federal government, it was the dividing line between the warring sections of the North and the South. And for the people of St. Mary's County, Maryland, it was the source of their livelihood and much of their food. And for some, it became their final resting place. On April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter was fired upon. President Abraham Lincoln issued a call to arms on the 15th, and the governments in the border states now needed to choose a side. On April 18th, the St. Mary's Beacon newspaper reported that when the intelligence that Fort Sumter had surrendered was received, the wildest enthusiasm broke forth among Leonard townspeople, and huzzas, congratulations, and rejoicings were the order of the hour. Maryland's governor, Thomas Holliday Hicks, refused to answer Lincoln's call for troops. He wrote to the Secretary of War that the organized military forces in Baltimore were for the South. They had taken possession of the armories and had all the arms and ammunition. So I therefore think it prudent to decline for the present, responding affirmatively to the requisition made by President Lincoln for 4 regiments of infantry. On the 17th of that month, Virginia declared that it would leave the Union, which made Maryland essential to the defenses of Washington, D.C. Confederate batteries began to line the shores of the Potomac River on the Virginia side after the Battle of First Manassas, creating a virtual blockade of the river and cutting off the primary federal supply line, causing ships to have to travel to Baltimore, unload their goods onto railroad cars, and then proceed to Washington, D.C. If Maryland voted to secede, the railroad supply line would also be closed, and the federal capital would be surrounded by hostile lands. On April 19th, riots broke out in Baltimore between Confederate sympathizers and federal troops passing on their way to Washington, D.C. Many felt these riots would be the catalyst that would pull Maryland out of the Union. The next day, President Lincoln sent a message to both Governor Hicks and Baltimore's mayor, asking them to come to Washington to discuss the situation. Lincoln hoped to preserve the peace. Maryland requested that no more troops be sent through Baltimore and indicated that they were desirous of protecting themselves and were not hostile against the federal government in general. Governor Hicks was urged to call a special session of the Maryland Assembly in late April after the upheaval in Baltimore, even though they were not scheduled to meet at that time. President Lincoln knew the legislature was about to meet and instructed General Winfield Scott not to interfere with the lawmakers. Scott wanted to arrest them and stop the meeting from happening because he assumed they were going to take action to arm the people against the Union, but Lincoln wanted him to just wait. The assembly normally met in the state capital of Annapolis, obviously, but it in Baltimore had been put under federal military control after the riots, so they planned to meet in Frederick. Governor Hicks continued to promote neutrality, hoping that by staying neutral, the warring sides would be forced to transfer the field of battle away from our soil so that our lives and property may be secure. They had said the same thing during the American Revolution. Maryland was not very much a warring state at any time in its life. The assembly met and voted against secession, but because they felt they did not have the constitutional right to leave the Union, not because they did not sympathize with the South. The Maryland Assembly tried to meet again in September to take another secession vote, but Simon Cameron, the Secretary of War, would not allow it. He stepped in saying that the passage of any act of secession by the legislature of Maryland must be prevented. If necessary, all or any part of the members must be arrested. And so 1/3 of the legislators were arrested and taken to Fort McHenry. And that prevented a new vote and brought the special session to end before it even began. Postmaster General Montgomery Blair published a notice in the St. Mary's Beacon on August 30th, announcing President Lincoln's interdicting commercial intercourse with the so-called Confederate states, knowing full well that Southern Maryland and Virginia corresponded in every possible way imaginable. And the people of Southern Maryland simply ignored the order. So Lafayette Baker, who was chief of the U.S. Federal Detective Police, came to Southern Maryland in October 1861 and was intending to shut down the mail service to the South. He was accompanied by 3 companies of men from General Joseph Hooker's division, and they were sent to permanently occupy the area if necessary. It was, and they did. Now, to combat all of this illicit trade, to interrupt the enemy's communications, drive the hostile boats from the area, and protect the loyal citizens, Union Naval Commander Ward proposed a flotilla to be established for service in the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries, chiefly the Potomac River. The flotilla was formed and arrived in May. Its main purpose was to restrict communication between Maryland and Virginia, to limit the Confederate activity along the river, both on it and on shore, and to defend Washington, D.C. And yet, the smuggling of supplies and men continued. So in April 1862, General Benjamin Butler was sent to Maryland, and he immediately declared martial law, and he positioned Union troops throughout the entire state and arrested Confederate sympathizers, critics of Lincoln, critics of the government, anyone he could find that he felt was sympathetic to the South. But still, Southern Maryland continued to aid and abet Confederate sympathizers. So it was only natural that when John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln, the manhunt focused on the Southern Maryland region, and the government called on the Potomac Flotilla for help. Secretary of War Stanton issued a War Department bulletin on April 22nd, 1865, that the accomplices to the assassination were in Maryland and all disloyalists were to be punished. So the entire peninsula was searched, with the forces marching in close skirmish line across it, but they could find absolutely nothing of note. A call also went out to increase the strength of the Potomac Flotilla, hoping to create such a dense picket line on the river that no boat would be able to get through. One of the vessels assigned to join them was the Black Diamond, which was a coal barge that looked similar to the one in this picture. And the Black Diamond was one of over 600 ships chartered by the Quartermaster Department to transport supplies to the Army beginning in 1861. The Black Diamond was stationed mostly in Alexandria, Virginia, and it was immediately available when this call went out for additional boats, so it was sent to join the special force, not knowing that it was too late or that this would be its final mission. During the 19th century, the quartermaster department was not yet a specialized military unit with its own transport vehicles. Instead, the department relied on contracted workers and detailed soldiers to work on board vessels hired or commandeered for transporting troops and supplies, like the Black Diamond. The other vessel in this story is the Massachusetts, which was a side-wheel steamer capable of travel in the Chesapeake Bay. It also went by the name John W.D. Pence, which was the name it was registered under as a civilian passenger vessel before the war. The use of vessels for troop transports began in 1861 during George McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, which was the first large-scale offensive movement in the Eastern Theater. On April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln while he was watching the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. At that same time, George Atzerodt was to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Lewis Powell was to murder Secretary of State William Seward. They were all to meet on the Maryland side of the Navy Yard Bridge and ride south together. Powell was unfamiliar with the city, so Booth had assigned David Harold to guide him to Seward's house and then out of the city to the rendezvous point. Only Booth and Harold made it out of the city that night. The 8th Illinois Cavalry was ordered to Leonardtown, here in St. Mary's County, on the night of the assassination, and one of them wrote, "The country is so thoroughly picketed and searched that a rabbit could have hardly made his escape through our lines without being discovered." A troop from the 13th New York Cavalry was also sent into southern Maryland with orders to search for Booth and arrest anyone who appeared suspicious. The next day, Flotilla Commander Parker received word at his quarters that the assassins might attempt to escape across the Potomac River and that he was to permit no boats to leave until further notice. In response to this news, Parker sent 10 gunboats and armed sloops to patrol the Potomac River with orders to seize all boats. Parker felt that the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay were being vigilantly guarded, but stated in a letter to Secretary Wells that twice the number of boats constituting the flotilla could not prevent a canoe from crossing at night from Maryland to Virginia. He therefore called for more boats, intending to fill in the gaps between vessels and form a blockade, making it impossible for even the smallest boat to escape. By then, as Commander Parker was establishing his picket line of vessels, Booth and his co-conspirator David Harold were hiding in the swamps of Charles County, Maryland, waiting for the right moment to cross the Potomac River into Virginia. They were being aided by Thomas Jones and Samuel Cox, both well-known Confederate agents. On Friday, April 21st, Jones was at the village of Allen's Fresh when a local man came in and said, "I have news that those fellows have been seen down in St. Mary's County." Jones knew this would pull the troops out of Charles County, so at dusk he went to where Booth and Harold were hiding and told them the time had come for them to cross. At about 10 p.m., the two conspirators took Jones's skiff and started on their way. But the strong flood tide carried them upstream and forced them back to the Maryland shore, approximately 12 miles north of where they had started. The next day, Saturday the 22nd, while Booth and Harold were resting from their first attempt to cross the Potomac and waiting for a second chance, 300 Union soldiers were marching from Camp Parole, Maryland to Alexandria, Virginia to board the troop transport Massachusetts the next day. And Quartermaster Lee was looking for vessels and men to send down the Potomac to join the flotilla and keep Booth's crossing from happening. But they were too late. Booth and Harold were successful on their second attempt and arrived on the Virginia shore early Sunday morning. Now, as we already know, one of the vessels that answered Quartermaster Lee's call was the Black Diamond. When it received these special orders, an additional 10 men plus one military captain were taken on for guard duty. The 10 men belonged to the Union Fire Department of Alexandria and had volunteered to join this mission. While serving on the Black Diamond, these men were employed and paid by the Quartermaster Department as civilian employees, not military personnel. The Massachusetts was making one of its standard runs between Alexandria and the Union stronghold at Fortress Monroe with a stop at City Point, carrying the 300 Federal soldiers from Camp Pearl. The men on this trip were to rejoin their regiments to complete their terms of service before mustering out, or would be continuing service as part of the occupying forces of the South. Most of the men on the Massachusetts were recently paroled prisoners of war, mostly from Andersonville, Georgia, but a few had also been held in Danville and Richmond, Virginia. A few others were returning from hospital stays and extended medical furloughs. All had been sent to Camp Pearl to prepare for their return to duty. On Sunday morning, April 23rd, more than a week after Lincoln's assassination, the Black Diamond left Alexandria and traveled the 92 miles to the Naval Depot at Piney Point, Maryland, arriving at 11 p.m. When the Black Diamond set off downriver, that morning was sultry with a northwest wind which brought out the sun. When they reached Piney Point, they received orders to join the picket line within a mile of Blackstone Island, so they sailed back upriver and reached that site at approximately 12:35 a.m. on April 24th and anchored for the night. The troop transport steamer Massachusetts set sail south at 5 p.m. on that same Sunday evening, also out of Alexandria. At the start, the weather was calm, but as the trip continued, the wind picked up and the waters became very rough shortly after dark. The moon, which was just a waning crescent, had set and was well below the horizon, making the night very dark. The men on board were sleeping, many on the open deck, when they were awakened by a jolt and loud noise. Traveling past Blackstone Island shortly before 1 a.m., the Massachusetts struck the Black Diamond on her port side near the boiler, just aft of the wheelhouse, and opened her iron hull right down to the waterline. The Massachusetts also sustained some damage, but it was not severe. Her bows were stove in above the waterline, leaving a hole large enough to take in 5 or 6 men abreast. In the dark, all became panic and confusion. Many men on board the Massachusetts, woken abruptly from their sleep, ran forward to see what had happened and found the bow filling with water. Some grabbed their coats, others their haversacks and equipment, and others went with just what they had been sleeping in. The captain ordered all on board to the stern in order to raise the damaged bow out of the water and keep them afloat. Seeing the other boat close by and still apparently afloat, the men began shouting to it to come closer and rescue them. According to a survivor, it was announced in a loud tone by some officer on board the Massachusetts to go on board the other vessel. Some complied, fearing that the Massachusetts was about to go under. Some jumped overboard into the water, grabbing planks and whatever they could find that would float. Others stayed put, and they tended to survive. The Black Diamond swung alongside, hoping to offload her crew onto the less damaged vessel, but instead, about 150 of the men from the Massachusetts started jumping onto the smaller ship, causing it to go down even faster. They had assumed it was a relief boat and commenced to jump like a flock of sheep going over a wall after their leader. And in coming alongside, the Black Diamond smashed one of the Massachusetts lifeboats, rendering it unseaworthy and leaving only one boat to assist with the rescue efforts. After the Black Diamond disappeared beneath the waves, the Massachusetts stayed near the spot until daybreak, picking up about 100 survivors in spite of the damage to her bow. Many of the survivors later related tales of being in the water for 3 hours or more, clinging to any bit of debris they could find and listening to the cries for help coming from others who had fallen or jumped into the river. Others wrote of watching their friends and fellow soldiers go down with the wrecked vessel. According to the survivors, Black Diamond sank stern first, moments after the additional men got on board, in less than 8 minutes and 21 feet of water, creating a great dark hole in the water and leaving the cabin exposed above the surface of the river. An article in the Pittsburgh Daily Commercial the following Wednesday reported that the Massachusetts succeeded in reaching Point Lookout in safety despite being crippled. Everyone disembarked there, and when the soldiers were all counted, they found that they were 65 men short. The survivors finally reached New Bern on the following Saturday, the 29th of April, after a long and hard passage. Many newspapers of the day contained reports of the collision and the presumed number of dead, but bigger events in the news overshadowed this incident, causing it to be nearly lost to history. On April 21st, President Lincoln's funeral train had begun its travels west, and its progress was being followed inch by inch in the newspapers. On the 26th, the hunt for the assassins ended when Booth and Harold were cornered in the Garrett barn in Caroline County, Virginia, and Booth was killed. And then on the 27th, the steamer Sultana exploded in the Mississippi River, resulting in the loss of 1,167 lives. Of the men aboard the Black Diamond, 6 were initially reported lost, but ultimately it was found that 7 had drowned. But of those, we know the names of only 4. Compiling a list of the names of the men lost on the Massachusetts is even more of a challenge, as they came from so many different regiments. Among the 80 known to have drowned from the Massachusetts, I've only identified 34 thus far. 35 bodies were recovered and were sent home. The rest lay on the bottom of the Potomac River. Since this incident was not the result of an act of war, the U.S. government took no responsibility for it, laying it all at the feet of the owners. Although it was impossible at first to determine where the blame for the disaster lay, Assistant Quartermaster Captain Lee had no doubt. He said, "From what I can learn, the cause of the disaster was extreme carelessness of the pilot or master of the Massachusetts." Later that same day, he reported the loss of men and recommended that both captains and pilots be arrested and brought to trial. All 4 men were arrested and held at the Central Guardhouse in Washington, D.C., but were soon released with written paroles requiring them to appear when needed for the inquiry at by the Board of Steamship Inspectors. The 3rd Supervising District of Inspectors of Steam Vessels did hold an inquiry into the incident, and they found that both pilots, but not captains, wholly disregarded the rules established for their government. Consequently, their licenses were revoked. And as I continue researching, I am continuing to try to identify the other soldiers who were lost, but whose names we just do not yet know.
Thank you, Karen. Wow, that's quite a story.
Yes, it is. It is.
And from there, we're going to dive into Sylvia's talk on the Wyoming bomber crash of 1943.
Okay. Um, it was interesting reading through Karen's book and now listening, because there are a number of sort of similarities in these two stories, but also, vastly different timelines. But I think it's interesting as well that certain events have kind of been lost to history, or at least in the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
So this obviously is the story about a airplane that crashed, but really it's about the 10 men who are on board. And I do have to acknowledge it's a lot easier to research 10 people than 80 plus. So this was a B-17 that was manufactured at the Douglas plant in Long Beach, California. It had a tail number of 423399. I have not ever located any photographs of the airplane before it became a wreckage. I don't know if any exist because it was brand new. So the thing that I always find particularly interesting is that even though we're 80 plus years removed from this event, practically everybody still has a connection to World War II. It was such obviously a global event, but everybody has a family member, distant or not, friends, etc. So there's always some kind of connection. And this crash occurred in basically my backyard in the Bighorn Mountains, outside of Buffalo, Wyoming. So, as I mentioned before, this is about the men. They are the heart of the story. And I always start with them, and I just want to quickly go over who they were. So, top line, left to right, just like you're reading a book. William Raymond Ronahan, he was the pilot. He was 24. He was from the Bronx, New York. And as you might guess from his photo, he was actually a New York City police officer. His father was also a New York City police officer. His family was Irish on both sides. His father was quite well known in the area for never having fired his service weapon and being very kind, which I don't think is usually the kind of reputation that gets passed down during that time period. Billy, as he was called, had 2 brothers and 1 sister and multiple foster siblings. His parents took in kids frequently. He loved to fly so much that he had actually saved his money and had purchased an Aranca C3, which was a small biplane. The co-pilot was Anthony Joseph Tallada, and he was 24 as well. He was from Houston, Texas, and he had 7 siblings. He also was very interested in aviation, and he had worked as an airplane mechanic at Hobby Airport in Texas prior to his time in the service. He was married to Elsie Marie Gotcher, and they had 1 son, Michael, and she was pregnant with their other son, David, when he crashed. Leonard Harvey Phillips was the navigator. He was 22. This is his high school graduation photo, even though he looks like he's approximately 12. He was 18. He was primarily from Nebraska and Kansas. He and his mom moved around a lot. Before he graduated high school, he had attended, I think, 8 different schools. But he did graduate from a very rural school in Clayton, Kansas, where he had 8 classmates, some of whom remembered him as being very studious, very smart, very driven. They knew that he wanted to go on to a bigger city, professional kind of life. He actually enlisted in 1940 in the Army, and he was working at Letterman Hospital in San Francisco. And then as the war started to really occur and progress, he wanted to switch his platforms and join the Army Air Corps. The bombardier was Charles Hulbert Suppas III. He went by Seppi. He was 23. He was from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and he was remembered by his high school classmates as being outgoing and funny and bubbling with nonsense. He had 1 sister who was 10 years older than him. His father had died very suddenly when he was only 10 years old, and he had a stepfather who was a World War I veteran. Seems like he also was interested in the military, aviation, etc. The flight engineer was James Alfred Hines. He was the oldest on board at a whopping 25 years old. He was from El Reno, Oklahoma, and he had 3 siblings. He had been a wrestler and a football player in high school, and shortly after high school, he and his mom and siblings moved to the Manhattan Beach, California area, probably for the war effort and for jobs. They already had some family members out there. So he also was married to Georgia Pauline Williams, who I believe went by Pauline. And she was just barely pregnant with their only child, John James Hines. I don't know if he knew about her pregnancy, but the family stories is that he did. So the next line down, Ferguson Theodore Bell III. He was the radio operator. He was only 21. He went by Ferg. He was an only child. And he grew up mostly in his mom's home state of Alabama. So his parents actually had married in Wyoming. Neither of them were from here, but they met here, married, moved around the country quite a bit, I think in pursuit of jobs for his dad. And then in 1937, they divorced. And Ferg kind of chose to stay primarily with his mom. Her family, her parents, his aunts, uncles, cousins, etc., were all in Thomasville, Alabama. So at the age of 18, he was working as a truck driver delivering beer. Oops, apologies. The next gentleman was Levon Miller, and he was 24. He was one of 5 children, and he grew up in Surveyor, West Virginia. His father worked in the payroll department for a local coal mine and had seen, for many, many years, the effects of coal mining on its employees and how hard that was. So he had told his sons that they could do anything they wanted to in life as long as it wasn't coal mining. And he really tried to encourage them to find other industries and get out of the area. That was obviously difficult during the 30s and even 40s. So we see that Vaughn took position working for the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, prior to his being drafted. He was also engaged to a young woman named Mary Ruth Hanaker. Our next gentleman is Charles Edgar Newbern Jr. He was the assistant radio operator. He was the youngest on board at 21, and he was from Wister, Oklahoma. He had a couple of brothers as well. He enjoyed playing the piano, guitar. He worked for his uncle's general store in his hometown. He was engaged to a woman named Frances Swafford. Shortly before he actually went off for his military training, he had saved his money and purchased a big fancy set of dishes for his mom. Next was Jake Floyd Pennick. He was the gunner and he was 22. He was one of at least 7, and he was from Juanita, Texas. It was a very rural and agricultural area at the time. He also was in the CCC for a while before joining the military. He spent his time in the CCC primarily planting trees in the Davy Crockett National Forest of Texas. He was married, and he actually met his wife, Dorothy Jo Gray, while he was stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He happened to be stationed there at the same time his brother Jack was stationed there. Jack was dating a local girl named Iva. Iva introduced Jake to her best friend, Dorothy Jo, and then there was a double wedding a few months later. And our last crew member was Lewis Marvin Shepard. He was the assistant gunner. He was 22. This is not a mug shot, by the way. This is his military ID photo. He was from Jacksonville, Florida, and he had 5 siblings. After high school, he had worked for a printing company. He might have been in the Merchant Marines, I'm not sure. And he liked to spend his free time at a local roller rink, obviously roller skating, but also looking for dates, looking to pick up chicks. And we know this because he kept a little brown book where he would record information. So the airplane, I think a lot of people are familiar with the B-17 to some extent. It was very heavily used during the war. It officially entered the war on July 1st, 1942, when the United States 8th Air Force bombed an occupied rail yard in France. During that time period, 1942, 1943, everything was escalating so quickly that the United States was just kind of throwing aircraft and crews at the war, at the effort. Great Britain was conducting nighttime bombing raids, and the US then stepped in to conduct daytime bombing raids. So there was this continuous effect happening. As I mentioned before, this one was manufactured at Douglas, but it had just been finished on June 5th, 1943, and then it crashed on June 28th. So it was brand new. When it was finished, it was ferried to Texas, to Love Field for modifications. There were a number of modification centers across the United States because as the war progressed and they started changing things to adapt for whatever situation, the original manufacturing plants maybe weren't capable of including those modifications. So it was flown to Texas, no problems. And then after its modification, it was flown from there to Walla Walla, Washington for assignment. And again, no reported problems. Keep in mind that this is something I made using straight lines, and Google Maps does not account for the curvature of the earth or anything of that nature. But generally speaking, the blue line was their intended flight path. So when the airplane was delivered to Walla Walla, it was also delivered to pilot Ronahan and his crew, and they had all just met within a matter of a couple of days. So they had all their various trainings across the United States. They'd been formed together as a crew at Walla Walla. They were given this airplane, and then they were being sent over. So Ronahan and his crew picked it up in Walla Walla, flew it to Pendleton, Oregon, which is a very short little hop skip there. Again, no reported problems. They were to take off from Pendleton and go to Grand Island, Nebraska as their first stop, in conjunction for information with another B-17. Our plane was delayed by about 10 minutes for unknown, unrecorded reasons. The other plane took off when it was supposed to, successfully landed in Grand Island. When this airplane didn't make it to Grand Island shortly thereafter, it was reported missing quite quickly. So the Army Air Corps conducted multiple searches for this aircraft. They did that via aerial searching and on the ground. They spent a couple of weeks in this effort before basically giving up. Something to keep in mind too, during that time period, there's a lot of attention being paid to the news. The military really isn't wanting to promote information about disasters, frankly. So although it wasn't a secret that they were missing, it was not widely spread either. And I think another factor into that was that they didn't know where they had gone missing at. So they tried to search across Wyoming and surrounding areas. 2 years went by. So 2 years of all of these crew members, family members, not knowing what happened. After a year, the military officially declared them to be dead, and families were able to process, life insurance policies, things of that nature. And then another year goes by, and August, they're suddenly found. So the Bighorn Mountains, they're young mountains. I'm trying to remember the highest peak is Cloud Peak, a little over 13,000. Um, they get a bit of traffic, but not that high, particularly not during that time. So there was a group of men. They were with a cattle company, and they'd been running their cows through the area, and they were conducting a roundup. They happened to notice something shiny on top of a ridge line. And after, their daytime activities, went up to go investigate and see what it was. And that's when they found the wreckage. They realized that it was military based upon the clothing that they found on the bodies of the men present. So they immediately went down to the nearest ranger station, notified the Forest Service ranger who was present, who then radioed it out, got the word to the military. They took immediate action. The gentleman shown here, Captain Kenneth Ham, he was tasked with being the investigator for this accident. He was currently stationed at Rapid City, South Dakota. It's now Ellsworth Air Force Base. And he had flown his more than 25 successful B-17 missions in Europe over the course of the war. So he was very versed in this aircraft and flight. He kind of threw together a group of other military personnel, the base commander, a military surgeon, doctor, a couple of medical corpsmen, and then just a couple of privates also to help move things back and forth. So there's always theories and thoughts about what happened. I think one of the most discussed theories is that one of the engines was feathered, failed, and they didn't realize how far off course they were. They were approximately 100 miles off course to the north. If this was true, maybe the aircraft was pulling to one side. It is, I think, useful to note that in Ham's report, he very explicitly mentioned that the condition of the engines could not be determined, other than the fact that they were all turning at the time of the crash. So they were flying somewhere around 200 miles per hour and just slammed into a mountainside made of rock. It does seem that they actually clipped the bottom of the plane first and kind of catapulted up and over. It was in the middle of the night. It was in the dark. I don't know what the weather conditions really were precisely. There isn't a weather station at that exact site. But for anybody who's spent time in the mountains here, you can vouch for the fact that it's very unpredictable weather. This image shows you a section of the debris field. The debris field is massive. And I included this one in particular because it helps, I think, for scale to see a human and a dog. So when Ham and the others made it to the actual crash site and they saw just the utter destruction, their purpose became a recovery mission to recover the bodies and send them home for burial. So they picked up 8 bodies from the west side, which is the side that they first impacted, and the top of the ridge, and then 2 from the east, probably the pilot and co-pilot. Excuse me. According to Ham, the men died instantly, fortunately for them. And he noted that all of their personal effects had been so ruined by the weather over the 2 years time period that there was very little worth retrieving. Ham did also note they may have been trying to gain altitude because a couple of the bodies had oxygen masks on. This is an image from 1945 when Ham was there. He also took a military photographer with him. And I think this photographer carried 2 cameras because some images are quite good and some are more like your, average home Kodak. There is a person visible at the top right in this, and I believe that's the base commander from Rapid City. Again, it helps with scale. So what you're looking at here is one of the larger pieces from the wreckage, and it's the stabilizer or the upright piece on the tail of the aircraft. And then in 2014, this is that same piece, but it's been flipped over, probably gone downhill a bit, whether by human interference, wind, etc. You can see my husband's hand for scale. This is one of the engines. So B-17s had 4 Wright cyclone engines. They're pretty massive, and the fact that this one is just torn free and out by itself is quite impressive. And then in the real center of the photograph there, that is kind of the top of the plane. That's not a window, though. It's actually a missing piece where a life raft would have been housed. And the framework, kind of the rusty metal in the foreground, we believe was part of the ball turret mount. Speaking of the ball turret, it always gets kind of all the attention because it's such a unique feature. But what was also interesting was this very top turret, which is what you're seeing here. So our flight engineer, James Alfred Hines, would have been responsible for manning the 2 guns in the top turret, along with his duties as the engineer. And your upper body was sort of inside this structure so that you could operate the machine guns and turn it back and forth using your hands and your feet. So you can see a real comparison here of 1945 and 2014. And unfortunately, what is all missing is because visitors to the site have stripped it. And I always remind people, it is still currently under these 2 federal laws that protect the site, but also it's the site where 10 young men died very violently. So just think of that and kind of keep that respect in mind. This is most of the recovery crew. So they eventually determined that they had found remains or parts of all 10 men. They had found something to send home for burial. They had found them and packed them off the mountain on what turned out to be VJ Day, August 15th, 1945. They didn't know that at the time. They didn't know that until they came back into town, into Buffalo, and had learned that the whole town had been celebrating, having a big party, and they had to go get the sheriff to wake up a hotel keeper so they could spend a night here. While the bodies were transported by Army ambulance to South Dakota, to Rapid City, where they were processed at a funeral home. And then they were sent by rail with a military escort to each of their respective homes. And that was, again, done very quickly. They all arrived at their homes within about a week's time or less. So circling back to the people, just a reminder of how young they were. For example, the bombardier, Seppi. So only 5 years prior, he was still in high school. He was concerned with acting in his school play, editing the yearbook, drawing cartoons. It was something he enjoyed doing. This one's my favorite because there's just so much going on in it. It was kept by a friend of his. I would assume the young woman in bed who apparently had just had an appendectomy because her girlfriends are looking at her appendicitis exploding in a jar. And you can see an airplane going by out the window. Okay, it's a little probably inside jokes. Lewis Shepard, he was at the roller rink looking for a date. And Lee Miller was possibly experimenting with moonshine with his brothers, according to family stories. So just kind of living their average American lives. And I think that's part of the real tragedy is that they never got the chance to grow up to really become who they were destined to become. Something else that I think is always worth note, within a month of the discovery of the crash, the regional chapter of the American War Dads group, and the members are shown here, they placed a quite large bronze plaque at the base of Florence Lake. Florence Lake sits right below the crash site. And this plaque honors the group. It has all of their names, their positions, and kind of a notation of how they died. So it's a very permanent memorial in their honor. And I think that's important. None of them were actually from here, but that did not matter. For all of the locals who were so affected by the war as well, they were Americans, they were soldiers, they were our boys, and they would be remembered. And thank you for tuning in. Thank you to Karen and Arcadia for arranging this as well.
Thank you for sharing that story. That's interesting, like hearing about all of the boys and their ages, and they, you always think it's like, not that they weren't adults, but you always think that they're adult men.
Yeah.
They're really not.
They weren't, and the older I get, the more I understand that. And also they were still kind of early in the war. 43 isn't really early, but for the B-17s in particular, they were actually an old crew. Like, start looking at other crew losses, the statistics. There's a B-17, another crash site in Wyoming where the whole crew died and they were training. There were 18-year-olds on board that one. So the fact that these were 21 to 25, they seem like babies to me, but they were actually older than a lot of their other soldiers.
Right.
One of the accounts that we have of one of the men, we call them men, but one of the people who was in the water for so many hours and they kept throwing him a rope and he just couldn't grab it, was a 16-year-old drummer boy from Connecticut. And his last words was, "Tell my mother I love her."
Oh,
It's,
man.
they're all, yeah, really, really, it's just, they're all heart-wrenching. And the one account of the survivors he said, the only order I ever disobeyed during my time in the military was not to jump off the Massachusetts. And I'm here to tell that
That's
story.
right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Powerful stories. And so interesting too, because both happened not in the face of the enemy.
Mm-mm.
Right.
My guys, the war's over. They've survived 4 years. They've survived hospitals and prison camps. They're on their way to go home,
Yeah.
and they
And
just don't make it home.
my guys never made it out of the United States.
Right, right, exactly, exactly. And they are our guys, aren't they?
They are.
You know,
Yeah.
you talk about yours the same
Yeah.
way I do mine. They're my guys. They're your guys.
I think I know
Yeah.
more of their family histories than my own at this point.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah. We don't have a big bronze marker, but we do have a Civil War trails marker that we just got up in the last couple of years here, which is nice. It's the first, but there is talk of getting a big bronze, marker on a boulder out on the island kind of thing. But we do at least have the Civil War trails marker now for these men.
Nice. I've always found it a little bit funny when the war dads put the marker in. They didn't have Forest Service permission or anything to do it. They just did it. They
Yep.
just went up, pick it up. It's about this big. It
Mhm.
was made by the foundry in a nearby town, and it's still there. And a couple years went by, and then the forest ranger in charge kind of addressed the topic, and he's like, "Well, it's permanent. It's now a part of the landscape. Fine by me." So, and
Good.
then they named the ridge Bomber Mountain, kind of also in honor of the crash. So,
Oh, nice, nice.
Good for
Yeah.
them, though.
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
And you mentioned, Sylvia, that a year after the crash, they were declared dead so that the families could move on. It took 7 years and Clara Barton and an act of Congress to get the missing men declared dead so that they could get their pensions and they could move on.
Well, thank you, Clara Barton, because I'm sure those actions
Absolutely.
then, wow,
Yeah. 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 That was tough.
that is very unfortunate. Just thinking about families losing a loved one, but then dealing with the realities of life and the fact that you have to have money to operate. And if your
Right.
main, check earner is gone,
hmm
yeah,
And for the women, if it was a husband that was lost in the shipwreck, it wasn't as difficult because they had a marriage license and it was expected that they were living off of the husband's pay. But if it was a son and they were relying on the son's pay, they had to get depositions from, first of all, someone that saw their soldier go down if they didn't have the body. They had to get the postmistress or master, usually a mistress in those cases, in those days, to testify that yes, they got a regular letter with a check in it from their son. The minister had to testify that yes, the woman was married to a person with that name and they had children. It was ridiculous, the proof and the trauma that they had to go through to prove that they needed that son's check.
yeah,
Demeaning, a little, yes,
yeah.
the way of the time, certainly, but just so much more difficult than it needed to be.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's a lot.
Yep, we've come a long way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, ladies, so much for presenting today. This was really fun, very informative. So we really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.